Here we go. Okay, thanks everyone for joining us. I am Sam Martinez. I'm the Executive Director of the APMM, and it is my great pleasure to introduce to you Erin Williams, who is a longtime APMM member and an architectural model maker, among other things, I'm sure. And I will hand off to Erin so that he can introduce our special guest today. But I have a couple things I wanted to say before I start that. And that is that if you're not familiar with Zoom, which everybody should be somewhat familiar by now, there is a menu at either the bottom or the side, depending on your platform and your system. But there are both raise hand and chat features. And throughout the conversation today, if you'd like to raise your hand or ask a question, you can feel free to do either the conventional way like this, or just put it in the chat and then, or raise your hand through Zoom, and then we'll try to get to your question at a stopping point. Are there any special announcements to make today, Jill or Bruce or Will, any of our board members who are on?
Register for the conference. Registration's open.
Yes.
Come on, it'll be fun.
Our virtual conference is happening March 18th to 19th. Yeah, just a few weeks away now, and we're super excited. We have almost 2 days and 9 sessions worth of really fantastic stuff that I think you'll all get a lot of use out of. And with that, Erin.
Hi, everybody. Sorry, and I'm always unprepared for these things, I guess. But today we want to welcome with us Teresa, and I always feel I mispronounce your last name. So could you say it for me just so that I can?
Yeah, my last name's Fankinel.
Fankinel, okay, because I always feel like I mispronounce it. I'm sorry, I didn't want to get it wrong.
No worries.
So thank you, Teresa Fankinel, and she's here to talk about her book, which I have right here, which is the architectural models of Theodore Conrad, the miniature boom of mid-century modernism, and this was your doctoral dissertation. And a very interesting book, very interesting read about Theodore Conrad, who I never knew about until she brought it up and came to us to ask us, to talk about this. I guess I'll pass it over to Teresa to give us a little outline of what she has and chat with us about it.
All right, I'm gonna try and share my screen. Can you all see it? Perfect.
We can.
Perfect. Let me just turn it on now. Okay, well, thank you for having me. I'm going to try and keep it very short so we have enough time to talk. But I do want to show you a couple of pictures and just ideas that are in the book that might be interesting. I'm super excited to be here because normally I get to talk to architects or students or curators, but I haven't been able to talk to a group of model makers. So this is extremely exciting for me because this is who Theodore Conrad was. Can you see the images changing? Yeah, okay, perfect. In 1956, a journalist called John Havis said about Theodore Conrad that Ted Conrad has probably built more New York real estate than anyone else in miniature. And about 25 years later, another journalist called Anna Quindlen said this about Conrad. Nelson Rockefeller sent visitors to see the view from his window. Doris Duke argued over doorways, and Jackie Kennedy first saw what President Kennedy's grave would look like from a Conrad model. Much happened since the architectural model maker Theodore Conrad started out and founded his modeling studio in Jersey City in 1931 when he was 21 years old, and the time that these newspaper articles came out. I'm showing you here on the left the view from Conrad's workshop in 1930-31 and the view in 2013. And you can see how much has changed. New York had a cluster of a couple of high rises in the 30s, and now it's this wall of skyscrapers. And Ted Conrad had a lot to do with these changes. The decades following immediately World War II, so the 50s and 60s, were when many of the changes in New York's architecture, but across the country began. And that's also the time of Ted Conrad's professional prime, when he was widely known for meticulous architectural models that were made with a high degree of detail and from cutting edge materials such as acrylic glass and aluminum. If you've never heard of Theodore Conrad, you are definitely not alone, because despite his prolific career in the 50s and 60s, his body of work was almost forgotten when I first started looking into it about 10 years ago. The first time I learned of Ted Conrad's name was almost by coincidence, because in 2011, I worked on a show that created an exhibition surveying 20th century architectural models, which was held at the German Architecture Museum. And one of the objects we were showing was the model of Lever House, which you see on the left. And as I started looking at the background of this model, I realized very quickly that Theodor Conrad was a central figure of interest, not just for this particular building, but for model making in the US in general. And this research led us to Conrad's family in Jersey City, who sent us a folder of Xerox copies of newspaper articles and photos and letters that he had written. And when I talked to Conrad's daughter soon after, she told me that she still kept dozens of models and folders and drawings and photos and everything that he had produced. And we included a lot of this in the book that we made for the show in 2012. But it quickly became clear that there's another project that was necessary to dig deeper. And that's what I did for the PhD, which I finished in 2016, and which was the basis on which this book was written. And that's the story this book tells, the story behind these models. In 2013, I finally went to Jersey City for the first time to look at this archive, and this is what I found. An entire basement filled with models, model pieces, photos, drawings, business files, and even a small number of tools left. This is me standing in the archive with a couple of these drawings. Much of this hadn't been moved since Conrad died in 1994, and I went through this over the course of several weeks and several years, actually, charting a course through this material, trying to create a basic documentation, identifying some key projects, looking at his modeling skills and also the studio practice. I have a list that includes all his projects, which is currently around 2,900, but there's definitely a lot missing, so this is not finished yet. The archive also documented not just his work, but the work of his employees and collaborators, and sometimes even competitors, among which the photographer you see on the right, called Louis Checkman, was definitely the closest and the most influential. And these two together were, in my view, two of the most inventive creators of modern architecture in the United States, not just for architectural circles, but for a wider audience. And I will show you why that is. Ted Conrad was born in 1910 in Jersey City to a family of German immigrants, and he went to Pratt, which is an architecture school in Brooklyn. And he left the school in 1931, which was a very bad time to leave school because of the Depression. But he was quite lucky because he was able to open his modeling studio immediately. He had been interested in craft and craftsmanship at model making since he was in high school. And when he went to architecture school, he interned as a model maker for a local, very well-known architect called Harvey Wiley Corbett, who introduced him not just to cutting-edge modeling techniques, but also to his clients, which would become Conrad's clients for most of his life. After he left Pratt, his modeling studio quickly received a couple of very high-profile jobs, among others, the new building for the Museum of Modern Art, models for the New York World's Fair, and also for an unbuilt 120-story tower in Madison Square Park that was supposed to be a glass tower, which would have been the first glass skyscraper ever. After the war, Conrad operated the largest modeling studio in the US, building models for buildings such as Lever House, the Sebring Building, the Kennedy Center in DC, and many others such as headquarters for Ford, Chase, Life, Heinz, all the big corporations he usually built the models for. Louis Checkman, the photographer, was less well known, but no less influential. He was a childhood friend of Conrad's who grew up on the same street and became a photographer who developed a style of model photography that was based on realism and detail-oriented depictions of models that became the norm in especially lifestyle magazines in the 30s and 40s. And I'm showing you here an example of what I mean by that.
Excuse me, Teresa. I'm going to stop you for just 1 second. We have a report that a couple of folks are having some trouble hearing you, and the sound is degrading. If there's some way that maybe you can You
Yeah,
could wear-
let's see.
Bring the mic closer or something? Thank you.
Is it better now? Yeah.
Those who were having trouble, please let us know if it's better.
Okay. Yeah, let me know if you're still having trouble. I'm gonna try and move my notes over here.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
All right, so as I said, these are the photos that Louis Checkman took in the 30s, and that's kind of what became the norm for showing unbuilt architecture in magazines and also in architectural magazines. New York was one of the centers of this new modeling boom that happened in the 50s and 60s, and which was focused on how models could represent something, represent materials, or also states of architecture such as vegetation or seasons, which was new at the time. So it was models that were made for public use and not for the design that were groundbreaking at the time. And that was, and still is in model research, something that people are usually not too much interested in. So some of the questions I was asking myself as I started looking through this archive were very basic. Questions such as, why were there so many models being made after World War II? Who were these model makers and where did they come from? And what was new about the way that they built their models? And also, was it just something that happened after World War II, or was there a longer development that this was based on? And so to find out what might be the cause of this miniature boom in the 50s and 60s, I looked at these developments that started in the 20s and 30s and then seemed to converge somewhere in the 50s. And there are three. What I'm showing you here is the first one, which is the development and use of new modeling materials. So from folded cardboard models that were used in the 20s, as you can see here, and they were built with hand tools and painted, to a new way of making models that started in the 30s, which was based both on hand and power tools and was made in large-scale modeling studios. These models were no longer folded up miniatures, but three-dimensional models that used prefabricated pieces, hundreds, if not thousands of pieces, using new materials such as plastics and aluminum, in addition to the pre-existing modeling materials. And this led to an increase in realism, an increase in size, and also in details in models, as you can see here. The second part is a change in the way that architecture is made because of an increasing split between experts that were inside and outside of architectural offices. This wasn't new. This was something that had been happening for a long time, especially in the 19th century, when new technologies such as the blueprint led to changes in the way that architects worked. So blueprints meant that you needed not as many copyists as you had, and that meant that architects had to specialize. So they would specialize, for instance, as renderers, but then you also had photographers. And model makers until the 20s used to be part of modeling of architectural studios, but at some point also became independent, especially at the moment when new materials came in and required you to invest in power tools, which architects were unable to do. And it also required more and more specialized knowledge. So the architectural model makers split off into a separate profession. Internally, these studios were also diversified. It meant that modeling studios employed specialists who were specializing in one aspect of model making. So for instance, trees, or making columns, or making cars, or assembling the model. And they all used to work under one foreman who would be the owner and operator of the workshop. That's how it worked in the 30s especially. And the third part, which is probably the most complex part, is a change and shift in the way that architecture was created away from drawing and toward three-dimensional tools and photography. And this is what I'm showing you here. You can see here models that were all made out of plexiglass. And plexiglass was initially introduced to represent glass. So it was used because it was transparent and there was no other material that was quite as good as representing transparency. But it was quickly also used for making massing models like the ones you see on the left. So it became the one material that was used throughout the process of a project. And these models also lent themselves to be photographed. And these photos, on the one hand, documented the project, but they also were able to give a preview of the building before anything was built, because they could use lower vantage points than was previously possible, and they could get closer to the model because the model had more details. It also meant that there were new model types that came out, such as sections or floor plan models that allowed people for the first time to have a 3D view of the model. It allowed them to study the lighting and landscaping of a project. And it also allowed them to show clients what their projects would look like. It would allow them to have a more participatory way of designing. To rearrange desks, for instance, was a very popular thing to do. And that was all done using these large floor plan models. Connected to the larger models was also, and photography was also an almost dollhouse-like love of detail that led to the photos that you can see here, especially since color photography came out in the mid-30s and allowed people to create even more realistic photos, where sometimes even today it's hard to tell if it's a model or a building unless you spend a lot of time looking at it. And this shift toward three-dimensionality also obviously came back to exhibitions. The 30s were a great time for museums and exhibitions through World's Fairs, such as the Chicago and New York World's Fair and the San Francisco World's Fair, new museums such as the Museum of Modern Art, or new types of exhibitions like the proposed Air Force Academy buildings, which were first shown to the client in a public exhibition, which essentially already told the client, there's nothing you can change here because this is finished. So it's a sales tool in that sense. Taken together, all of these three developments, so the new modeling materials, the new way of practicing architecture, and desire to work in 3D and with photography, all of this led to this rise in models in the 1950s when all of these developments converged. I'm just showing these very briefly because I think I should stop here. One of the new tools that came out in the 1930s were model drawings that were essentially kind of drawings that told the model maker and his employees how to put the model together. So it was a planning tool, but it was also an assembly description. And of course, this archive of Theodore Conrad also had a lot of letters and conversations between model makers and architects who often had disagreements about who was responsible for certain aspects. So the architects often tried to control the process as much as possible by sending in paint chips or other instructions. And that's also very fascinating to see in this archive. The book finally is the first attempt at writing the history of the miniature boom from its beginning in the 1920s to its fade out in the 1970s. It is the first look that I know of the work of an architectural model maker that goes into so much detail. And despite its title, it's not a biography of Theodore Conrad, but it's a report on how model making changed and was part of the tremendous changes throughout the 20th century toward modernism becoming the new architectural standard in the Western world after World War II for a short period of time. The book looks at three-dimensionality as an aspect of architectural thinking. And it also looks at how a wider discussion about good design and craftsmanship is influenced by these representations, so these kinds of models that architects were choosing to argue with, which I think is a very, very current topic, because we do see how the way we look at architecture today, be it on Art Daily or Instagram or any of these feeds, over time shape taste and create a new good taste for architecture that previously hasn't existed. And that's the same thing that happened with these kinds of models. The book includes 5 chapters looking at new innovations. So from model making as a new kind of profession, to new modeling materials, to the way that model makers worked using model drawings, and then looking at photography and exhibitions that use these models and transform them into something that hadn't existed either. I will stop here and allow Aaron to take over.
Yeah, no, thanks so much, Teresa. That's great. So many interesting things in the book. I've read through, a bunch of it. And it's interesting hearing, sort of how in the 30s it sounds like model making sort of shifted. It's interesting also seeing how, it's how much that relates to the models that we do today, and how similar those can be and how much it sort of hasn't changed since then. So, I'm interested to find out how was that research in finding out sort of other model builders, or because like we talked about before, and as a model builder, you're sort of in the shadows. I always think of it as back of house, and we're not really credited very often for things that we do. And I'm wondering how difficult was it to actually find, like you said, competitors. You found some stuff about competitors. How difficult was it to find sort of information on that even?
Yeah, I think that's one of the key points that keeps coming up every time you start talking about models, is that if you look at collections, and I've worked at museums for the past more than 10 years, different kinds of museums, you do notice that what most collections do is they credit the architect and the lead architect, not even all the architects, but the owner of the architectural firm. And maybe they give you the dates of the buildings, but they don't go into detail when it comes to drawings or models. Or photos are credited more often because of the copyright issues. But so I think this is a practice that has existed for a really long time. And it's been extremely lucky that we found this archive, which was private at the time, because it was the one chance to actually get more information on the model maker. And Conrad was kind of a hoarder. He collected everything about himself. He thought he was really important. He collected every little newspaper article or any mention of his name. And in the process of collecting a lot about himself, he also collected information on other model makers who were competitors. So sometimes the newspaper articles weren't just about him, but about model making. And then you have other names and you can start looking them up. None of those other names have archives that are in collections, as far as I know. There's one or two exceptions, but they're very small. So it's looking for the needle in the haystack. There's relatively little you can find except for 2 or 3 others from that period of time. And I think that's slowly changing. I know that there's a couple of model makers now who are close to retirement age who are looking for collections, but I think the problem is also that architectural collections especially obviously have not learned to change, and they're still looking for the big fish. They're still looking for a Mies or Le Corbusier or these kinds of things. But I think these practices are slowly changing. I think there is a recognition of the fact that architecture is a collaborative process, and it's not just the architect who designs and creates and makes things.
So everybody who's listening, sign the bottom of your models.
Yes.
Put a little signature, a little pad made by, It's interesting. Yeah, so another thing in the book, one of the quotes I found was from Theodore Conrad, and I thought it was really interesting. And he says, I must say, I revolutionized model making so you could see how good a building looked. My complaint now is that the clients look at the model and nobody studies it, and the architects sell the job, good or bad. I think we've gotten worse architecture along with this wonderful tool. I thought that was a really interesting quote, thinking about sort of what we do and how we do it. And I think we all work really hard to sort of create these amazing pieces, or these things that are interesting to look at. And it's interesting to think that it does. I mean, I'll admit that in the places that I've worked in the past, they've been like, oh, we haven't gotten as far as we need to on the design. Let's build a model, and then it's like, everybody's like, ooh, a model. And then, but, do you think Theodore Conrad really sort of totally felt that way? Or, I mean, I guess he said it, so.
I think he said that toward the end of his professional career. So I think he said it in the late 60s or 70s, which was the time when modernism was falling out of favor. And it was the time when younger architects came in and criticized modernism as a whole for having created cities that were very segregated in terms of, you have a business district, you have a district where you live. These kinds of urban planning decisions that were made in the post-war years were especially criticized. And I think I think he was right in the sense that the models did help sell these jobs and these projects. And over time, because there were so many of them, they led to changes in the city that weren't seen as favorable in the 60s and 70s, especially. So I do think that he agreed with that. He was a classically trained architect who had studied in the Beaux-Arts system, so copying 19th century architecture, beautifying urban spaces. And I think he was quite taken aback when he saw what modernism led to ultimately. I think he also kind of congratulates himself on it in that quote, because he acknowledges how powerful his work is. His work was so good that it ultimately led to something that was relatively bad, which wasn't his fault. That's kind of what he says. And I think
I'm going to start doing that in my shop. Be like, oh, my work's so good. See, you got that project.
Exactly. And I think that's kind of the other point that he's also making, is that he can't choose the architecture he's modeling for. The only thing or not the only thing, but one of the things he does as a model maker is edit out the unnecessary detail that might be ugly or, you know, unnecessary in the sense of a presentation, which is always better than the final building, because you don't need the signs, you don't have the messy curtains or all of the things that clients bring in when the building is finished. And a model is kind of an ideal reality that looks better than the real building.
Yeah, I always joke with the architects here that, they're like, oh, do you know Revit really well? I'm like, well, I know it in a different way, because I destroy models. Like, you guys build them up to this thing and then I destroy them down to like what I need. Basically it's editing. And you're right. It's sort of an interesting way to do it. I just wanted to comment. I took some notes here on the side, that photo of that model on the truck in the beginning gave me heart palpitations, but that's a whole thing. It's interesting seeing them move a model that way, when I think, people nowadays would drive down the highway at like, 60 miles an hour and they're like, oh, it'll stay, it's fine, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, that was a different time.
Yeah, definitely.
The model went through the Holland Tunnel, as far as I
wow.
remember.
Oh, that's right.
And it must have had a police escort, because that truck must have been going 2 miles an hour.
Yeah.
At the most.
Man, I can imagine how terrifying that would have been for him, just to get it over there. But my gosh. What was the other thing? It was interesting. You talked about sort of them creating a groundscape and, landscape, and creating that so that people could see it. And just wondering, I always find that interesting that when we create sort of groundscapes or populate a model with Entourage, to me, it's a little bit like lying. I mean, I'm going a little extreme on that, but we're creating, sort of an idea of what the space will be used for, when the public might not use it for that at all. And it's so, it kind of goes back to the sales piece, and it's interesting that he sort of started doing that, and bringing that into models as well. And I wonder if he felt the same way. But yeah, it's an interesting thing.
Yeah, I think this is one of the key developments that happened in the 30s, that models got bigger. And models were being photographed in a more realistic way. So models had to include more details than they used to include, because before then, maybe it was a white baseboard that they were standing on. And I think these details, yes, there was a sales aspect to it, but then I think they were also meant to photograph really well, to give a preview of something. So often these photos were meant to be a preview in a magazine. And what architectural photos at the time would, or any photos even today, would be trying to do is show an inhabited building, or a building that's well past its initial life, when the trees haven't grown in, or maybe it's winter, or maybe there's still some equipment that's standing around. So these photos were always meant to create an inhabited project, maybe 5 years into its life. And the standard for that was summertime. So you would have trees and foliage, that was the standard, but there are some, like the one I showed you, where it's fall, for instance. So I think that was a New England setting. So fall was a better season. So there was a lot of detailed and theory about how you create the perfect model landscape, and also the perfect season, the perfect weather. You don't want it to be raining or snowing. That's a different kind of model you're working on. And architects are very involved in that. Sometimes the model maker would get one set of plans from the architect, another set of plans from the landscape architect, and then the photographer would come in who had been to the actual site and looked at the viewpoints that you would finally get when the building is finished, and then try and simulate that in the model. And this went as far as having the model built in partitions, where you could take out walls and especially windows, and push in the view camera to get exactly the same shot you would be getting in the final building. So that was an elaborate production, which you don't necessarily always see unless you know how much work it is to create this.
Well, that's amazing. Yeah. To think of the cameras we have now, like the little lipstick cameras and this, meanwhile they were using like mirrors and everything else, it's amazing thinking that. Not to shift a little bit, but to ask, I know you met his wife, Theodore Conrad's wife, and his family. Can you tell us a little bit about his personal life? I know the book was more about sort of mid-century modernism and models, but what did you discover about his life and sort of who Theodore Conrad was?
Yeah, this is actually a funny, also kind of an interesting story of how research and how history works, I think. When we were first starting this project and finding out about him, I was working in Frankfurt in Germany. And we had been trying to get in touch with them for a long time. And eventually we decided to just send them a picture of Frankfurt, a postcard, and say like, hey, we're these people we would like to meet. And a few weeks later, I got a phone call from a suburb of Frankfurt where a German, I think, cousin of Conrad's wife called me and said, hey, we're Germans. We would like to help. We're related to Conrad. And so we started talking and realized that his family was actually German. And when I first, ultimately a few years later, when I went to Jersey City, I went to their house and learned that his wife had immigrated to the US in the 50s. Conrad's family were German immigrants who had been in the US a bit longer, but they had lived in a German-speaking part of Jersey City. The kids spoke German. I sat down at the kitchen table, and this entire setting was a German-speaking setting that had kind of survived for decades in this workshop. And that's how we started out. And then what I realized talking to the family is that everything was preserved. Conrad had kept his early study drawings. From the early study drawings until the moment he died, everything was left. And that family had just kept it in the hope that someone might be interested in it. And one part of the archive was their personal collection of ship models and other things that they were trying to return to Germany because they had come from, I think, Bremerhaven, which is a city on the coast. So they were always looking back at this long history, family history. And one of the most interesting aspects of that was that the family, when I walked in there, started speaking German to each other, which it was like a time capsule because the mother had kept her accent from the 50s. And you could tell that there was a long history of many other things, not just model making, that was preserved there.
Interesting. So now, how did you keep from like jumping up and down when you got the phone call that you could come and look at this? that it was all still preserved and whatnot. I mean, that must have been a find, huh?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of those very rare finds that you have to get lucky to be able to do that. I don't think there is another archive of that scope that exists from that time, at least. Well, yeah, it was just luck. You just realize you struck gold for that kind of research. Yeah.
That's funny. That's great. No,
Yeah.
I want to open it up to anybody else who has questions. I'm kind of hogging the questions here. Does anybody in the audience want to turn on their camera and have a question, or not even turn on your camera if you don't want to? Okay, Paul, I see you got your hand up.
I'm going to jump straight in there.
There you go. Thank you.
How are you doing? Yeah, it's fascinating. It's really interesting. We kind of acquired the John Thorpe archive, which is mostly photographic. So we don't have many models or anything, but it's like this detailed archive of every single thing, every single project, the invoices, paychecks, everything for the whole business. It's like 100 years of history. It's fascinating. But what's really interesting is that your journey that you've taken sounds very, very familiar in the way that you start to explore it, and you start to look at the materials and how the models are used and over time. So there's a real just familiarity with that sort of thing. I think it's really fascinating. But one of the other things I was going to ask is about, in terms of the archive itself, how is it being preserved? Are there issues in terms of conservation? How large is this? It sounds like it's huge.
Yeah.
And who's responsible for that?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So we, I actually know about John Thorpe's archive, but this is the British side of it, and I'd love to actually see that one day.
There you go, connections made.
Yeah,
excellent.
Vice versa. Yeah.
Exactly. So when I first came there was no one who wanted to take the archive. I went to MoMA, I went to Columbia. I actually almost begged people to take it, and then there were some, so his wife died, and there were some changes in the family that made it clear that the archive was either going to be in storage and probably lost at some point, or it had to go somewhere. And then the Avery Library in New York agreed to take the papers, so the drawings, the photos, the invoices, most of it, not all of it. And some models were sold to MoMA, to the Heinz Architectural Center in Pittsburgh, and in the UK, there's Niall Hobhouse, who took 2 models, I think, 3 models. So some of the bigger models and the more well-known projects went to collections, but there's still a lot of models that they haven't been able to give to anyone. And some of them are still, I would say, quite interesting. So the model has been ripped apart. The archive has been ripped apart in order to preserve it, which was the only way to do it. But there have been some things that were lost in the process. And as for the conservation, so I showed pictures in the beginning where you could see them in the basement, which wasn't necessarily terrible, but it also wasn't great because it wasn't climate controlled, and there was a leak on one of the models dripping water. So they definitely need restoration, some more than others. Conrad was very good at preserving his work. So he had custom built bases and plexiglass covers, which would screw into the bases. So they were kind of sealed off quite well, most of them. And their condition was surprisingly good. What's much more of a problem, I would say, is the model drawings, because the drawings were used when they were making the model. So they're often ripped apart or almost ripped apart, and they need extensive restoration. But there's very few of these drawings that survive, as far as I know. And for that reason, it's spectacular, because there's some sets that are almost complete that still exist.
Sounds like a challenge for the APMM to find a new home.
Yes.
I was going to say, it sounds really funny. You talk about these working drawings like they're, because they're preserved and because, there are not many of them. But I mean, to think of this, the chicken scratch that I do in my shop being, 50 years from now, people being like, oh my God, we have to restore that. Like,
I know.
It's amazing thinking about that. Like, no way.
I know. I know it's a tool, and you don't think about it as being worthy of. It's not a presentation drawing, right? It's not something you're going to hang on the wall. But in some ways, I think these are even more interesting because they show a studio practice that is long gone and that you have no evidence of, except for those few drawings that have survived. Yeah.
Interestingly, as well, we have the person who's now sort of in charge of the kind of Thorpe archive. He made a model of the Lever House model. So he made a scale model of the model, and we still have that in our studio.
It sounds like
very meta.
Yeah.
That was a bit mind bending that he was making the model of the model, not of the building. It took a little while, didn't it, to get our heads around that.
Yeah.
But you got, it's like a piece of furniture at that point, right? So you got to figure out how it's going to fit in things, So that's amazing. Anybody else have any other questions? I mean, I have a ton, so I can just keep going if anybody, I'm sure I would love to hear other people chime in and chat.
Well, it sounds like we have the architectural wing of the model making museum supplied,
Yeah.
stocked, if you will.
There you go.
But we just need to have like lots and lots of funding and a place to put it.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's always the challenge, is the funding, right? That's always the challenge of, do we save it or do we not?
Yes.
Well,
I mean,
Teresa, sounds like
Sorry,
you've been talking to people. If you're saying, can you take our model? I wonder if any of the museum people have said, why don't you guys have a museum? And if they have any helpful advice on how people go about doing that, besides, just having Bill Gates pay for it,
Yeah.
which he should.
Which he should, yes, because yes, it's that important. Well, I think museums. I mean, I have personal knowledge of how museums operate because I work for a museum. Museums are very hard sometimes to crack because they have very specific collection policies. So MoMA, for instance, has a policy that means they only take the most important project of someone's work. So maybe they take 3 objects or 3 drawings or photos. So their collection practice is actually quite difficult because it takes the most important object out of an archive and transfers it to MoMA. And then the other stuff is harder to sell, so to speak, because no one wants to eat the carcass that someone else has already ripped apart, which is not always the case. But so there's this practice on the one side, and then there's other practices where museums say we only collect locally or we only collect certain specific kinds of projects. And model makers kind of fall between the cracks there because their work is usually, filed under the architect who they worked for or with. And I think that's where awareness is slowly shifting, where collections realize we also need to collect model makers' works, photographers' works. We also have to ask how architects have worked in their studios. Who are your collaborators? Who is the person who actually made the drawing or the model today, not who's the head of design? And I think that is really changing. And I think that's where Conrad and the work that we've done with the book and these collections is quite important because it highlights what you lose if you don't collect. It highlights what else disappears if collections don't change the way they look at design and architecture as a whole. And you need a lot of money, that's true, and a lot of storage space.
Yeah, that's usually the issue with models, right? There's a lot of storage space. I know from working in an office setting, it's like the clutter just happens it gets pretty intense after a while, and eventually you're just like, I mean, not that I've ever done this, but models tend to fall off the table sometimes when you want to get rid of them. But it's unfortunate that you're like, but there's only so much you can save or so much space that you have, and but yeah, I always wonder that, like, what's the point that you want to save something or keep something and
Yeah.
protect it?
Yeah. Well, what I can tell you from my experience is that once you retire, you're going to look back on it and you're going to wonder what is valuable, it has to be kept. And at that point, it's often already too late because the important model maybe fell off the table 15 years ago.
Yeah.
But it's also normal, right? Because you don't want to work in a museum. You have to work. And of course, then things get lost. And I think that's how natural selection happens.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, I can even relate from, like, I just recently switched jobs and working at Perkins and Will now, but even in that switch, I had a collection of photos at my other job, on their server that, it had to be thousands of models in a 20-year stretch there. And, moving over here, I see the ones that I pulled, sort of cherry picked. And then I'm like, wait, I don't have access. I mean, I'm sure I can still get access to it, but, just in that process of switching, you don't think of all these things like, oh, that one model that I did that was really cool, and you don't save that. So, but
yeah.
Oh,
I think that's
From
also,
Aaron,
sorry.
I have a question from C. Young that is asking, just curious, what were the price ranges in today's dollars, if possible, for Theodore Conrad's models?
Excellent question. That's also documented. I would have to look at a converter because I don't have that. I don't know that right now, but for a model in, let's say, 1955, a large presentation model for, let's say, new headquarters for Ford or Chase, that was built in 2 or 3 weeks, you would have probably paid something like $50,000 at the time, which is a lot more today, probably 3, 4, 5 times as much. You can just convert that online. But so it depended on the size, on how quickly you wanted the material. And then also the importance of the model. So if you made a design model, it was cheaper because then the model maker also knew that you're going to come back because you're going to probably want another one and ultimately the presentation model. So there was a price scale for different kinds of models, but a large model today by Conrad could probably be hundreds of thousands of dollars.
See, what I'm hearing right now is we're all underpaid.
Yeah.
So I'm just kidding. So,
Yeah.
but yeah, that's interesting to hear that, I mean, I guess that was the heyday too, when everybody wanted a model and then they were using it in publications and they were using it in all different things. So, it's definitely, I mean, I think marketing models can get, pretty high these days too. If somebody's has a marketing center and they need a beautiful model to go in there. So they can get pretty pricey.
Well, I guess it's also changed in the sense that now you can have a rendering or you have a computer model and then have different kinds of outcomes. I think it's diversified more. Back then, the model was what the architect wanted to sell the project. Photos were important too, but there wasn't anything else you could have substituted for the model.
There you go.
So.
Well, that was another thing that I was asking. Like, I know we had chatted a little bit about it before, but we talk about Theodore Conrad getting into new materials with metals and plastics, which were new, relatively new then. My thought is now today, what are those new materials? And because it seems like we're still using plexiglass, we're still using plastics. What materials I wonder would be the future of model making? And I don't know. I was sort of asking everybody, I think too. If anybody has ideas.
Yeah, I think that's a question that I would be very interested in as well. What all of you think what the future is. I think the most obvious in the last 10, 20 years is rapid prototyping and 3D printing, which is also very challenging, by the way, for preservation because of all the glues and all these different kinds of materials that if once these model enter collections, then we have to find new ways of preserving those. So every new technology creates its own problems when it comes to preservation. So it's always good to keep good documentation on what you use for those new models so that the conservator can find out what it is. So I think that's, in my view, probably one of the more groundbreaking innovations, but I'm sure there's others that I don't know of.
It's interesting with we sort of did some work with Zaha Hadid's office, and her favorite model was just a clear acrylic block model, which she called the Jelly Bean, and is that Cincinnati? Is that the right one, Will? Sorry.
The Art Institute?
Yeah, Cincinnati is the Modern Art Museum in Cincinnati. The Americans gonna correct me. Yeah.
So anyway, the acrylic model, it's just block acrylic, almost double sided. A few bad repairs on it that I had to sort of fix a bit, but I think it's insured for something £750,000 or something. But it's just some lumps of acrylic. But the 3D prints, the modern 3D prints, well, they've got them in exactly the same models in 4 or 5 locations on exhibition. And while we were visiting, there was some damage from insects, pooing on them basically. And their thing was, oh, what's that? And actually it doesn't matter because we'll just 3D print some more. So the 3D printed models had very little value at all because they just produce some more. But as you say, they don't actually last. We don't know how well they'll last, but the acrylic model had the value to it and the 3D printed one didn't. So it's an interesting thing there. But the other thing I think we've just done a thing with our students. We're talking about getting them to do research into materials, and there is a generational shift. There's a generation looking at more sustainable materials and thinking about where they're from, etc. And I think long term, maybe in 10, 20 years, that will have an impact in what we make models of. So there's a lot of, and what happened is that probably only in the last 5 years, there's a kind of shift with companies into looking at where their materials are coming from. And so there's things like paper foams and things like that that are coming on board, materials that haven't really been used before, replacing the existing materials. So I think it'll be interesting to see where they go.
Mhm.
Thoughts
I think
on
that's really, really good points also. I think the first one about saying like, oh, if this model is destroyed, we can just print another one is going to work until that technology is gone and you can't make another one. And then the question is, oh, which one is the original, right? And that's usually what everyone in history wants to know, what's the original one? Which at that point you realize maybe there is none in these cases. Yeah.
I hate to do this. Ooh, sorry, go ahead, Bruce.
The 3D printed model has to be built by a model maker and assembled at the very least, if not painted and all kinds of other processes. So that's kind of not right to think that a 3D printed model can just be 3D printed again without any other work.
Yeah, it's a bit
Sorry, Jill, I
short-sighted.
jumped in on you.
It's okay. I was just going to toss out. I have an interesting architect that I do work for that builds the CAD models, has me 3D print the models, but at the end of the day, he likes the old gessoed white on white look. So we work out every aspect of the technology to make it look like it's a hand-built old school model, which they're beautiful. I mean, they're really beautiful, white on white. It forces a focus on the space. His whole thing is how these spaces are going to work as residences. And I just think it's an interesting twist because he's trying to eliminate the technology and get back to this old school, what's the space going to feel like approach.
Mhm.
I hate to do this. Oop.
Sorry.
No, I just wanted to jump in really quick because we're at we're 1:57 right now, and I know we're about to end. So we can keep talking. Everybody stay on who wants to, but before we start to lose people, I just want to remind people again that we're having our virtual conference. The Association of Professional Model Makers is having their virtual conference March 18th and 19th. So if you would like to come, please register online, and our website is www.modelmakers.org. And please join us if you can. But again, sorry to interrupt the conversation. I just want to be respectful of everybody's time. We can stay on as long as we need to, so please feel free. So Kevin, we'll get to your question in a sec. Sorry about that.
Thanks, Aaron, for mentioning that. We do have a couple of questions. I see that Eric raised his hand. I've also got Kevin with their hand raised, but before we get to Kevin, Teresa, I'd like to ask if you tell us or put it in the chat where somebody could buy the book if they choose to purchase it.
Will do.
Okay, and then Kevin, if you have a question, please speak up.
Hi, everyone. Hello. Thank you very much for your presentation, by the way. It's quite informative. So I just have a question about, the young architects you spoke about. I mean, it was quite interesting how you mentioned that, young architects, I believe in the 60s, were kind of concerned about how spaces, especially urban spaces, were kind of segregated into like business districts as well as other, these other spaces like retail stores. And today I see a lot of architects trying to kind of like integrate different spaces or like different buildings. So for instance, you can have a model which is like a residential building that, probably has an urban center across the street or something like that. And it kind of has like a bus stop close to it. And so I think it's part of mobility oriented development where you have like this bus stop. So you just, kind of get in the bus and then you get to town within, 10 or 5 minutes. Mm-hmm. So I've been seeing a lot of architects making models like those. And I'm wondering whether that sort of thinking influenced, how spaces are kind of designed today.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a really good point. I think that's something that started shifting in the 70s away from these segregated, not just buildings or building types, but neighborhoods, right? Because, I mean, if you think of New York, Robert Moses was quite celebrated back in the day for creating these highways that on one hand made certain areas more accessible, but also other areas were raised or disappeared or were cut off from the city. And in the late 60s and 70s, there was a very critical movement that was looking both at reconstruction, urban redevelopment, but also preservation. And Jane Jacobs is quite well known for her book, The Death and Life of the Great American Cities, which was a critique of modern urban planning and was exactly describing what you just said, what you saw in recent models, which is mixed use of urban areas, which means that an area has a specific use during the day, during the afternoon, in the evening, at night. So there's no empty areas, and that in the mind of people in the 70s was supposed to make urban areas safer, because there's always people present, and if there's people who are looking out the window, the street is going to be safer. So there's a lot of these ideas that came up in the 70s, and I think that kind of critique has become more powerful in the 80s and 90s and until today because of postmodernism, who were looking back at historical cities, so cities in the UK or in Italy, these small and detailed cities where you live in a house and downstairs there's a shop and outside there's something going on. And I think that's where we're at today. I think we're still kind of following the 80s and 90s in that design philosophy that we want mix. We think mix is good because it is more varied, and it is also probably economically more sustainable, because if the shop owner moves out, maybe you convert it to an apartment or something else. So there's just more detail is usually good, is what people think today, I would say.
Mhm. Thanks for answering.
That's interesting.
I think
No.
Eric had a question as well.
Nope, still can't hear Eric.
Okay, can you hear
There
me
we
now?
go. Gotcha. All
Okay.
right, I got you now.
Sorry about that. Technically challenged sometimes.
I do it all the time.
Just a really quick comment in addressing this really poignant need for kind of trying to preserve, legacy model building techniques, pieces, certainly all the working drawings, the design drawings to make physical models, that sort of thing is just fascinating. And one of the problems, and challenges, I guess, that we have had at our firm is trying to keep track of a physical bank of samples, because they have value, when you're trying to do other projects or show a client what's possible. And there's such a range of these techniques and methodologies. And so what I started doing is I have a very limited amount of space in my shop to kind of keep examples to show clients, but I try to keep the best that I can. And so recently I have been taking on this idea of doing this archive just with charrette cards of different methodologies. So whether it's some sort of facade treatment, something like that, put settings in there, for whatever it is. So I'm just, I'm dismantling some of these pieces that are going to be lost, right? And so just trying to preserve some aspect of that methodology to pass that on. So it's a bigger question also of legacy physical model building. We are trying to figure out how, again, to preserve as much of those pieces, the techniques, kind of the artistry of it, the art of, these are artifacts. And so one of the other pieces is trying to come up with other ways to document these projects. If you cannot have a physical piece, which is ideal, because you have to take care of it, keep it clean, figure out where it's going to live, all of those things. We have the advantage of having an excellent photographer at our firm who has taken incredible shots of a lot of this work. And so I've started to put them together in very short little MP4s, kind of Ken Burns documentary style, kind of, maybe there's moving images and maybe there's a pleasant soundtrack behind it, just to kind of, it's a more engaging way to look at some of these pieces and to preserve them, at least in a way that people can see them. It's not the same as having an artifact in your hand, kind of the primary function of a model, I think, to understand things. But just as a suggestion to others, if you don't have that space, there's some other ways that you can kind of, strip down some of these pieces that may be going in the dumpster. And I don't know, for me anyway, it's really hard. It's like letting go of a child or something, something you've spent time on. So just some other suggestions for how to save some of that stuff. That was it. Yeah, thanks.
Wonderful.
Eric, what firm are you at?
MBBJ here in Seattle.
Great,
Yeah,
awesome.
yeah.
Sorry, Terry. So did you have something?
This is wonderful. I wish everyone was doing so much work to preserve their own techniques and everything. I mean, ultimately, you're probably going to run into the problem of having to preserve your MP4s. which is also going to be obsolete. Every technology you use to preserve another technology will eventually also go. But I think it's great. I think if I can give you any advice for preservation is to use as many different medias and as many copies as possible, because that's what Conrad did. These folders he created of Xerox newspaper articles, he produced in the hundreds, and he just gave them out to friends and family. And that's how maybe 10 of them survived over time, because most of them disappeared. But making copies is always, that's the way to go of everything.
Yeah, go ahead, Lisa.
Hi, Teresa. First, I'd love to thank you for your book. I can't wait to read it. My question is about the future of model making as the world sees it, because I'm sure you gained a lot of insight looking into Conrad's work and his competitors and the models and their use, and maybe thought about how it compared to how models are used today. And where the trajectory is what I'm interested in. Where is it going? Because I know 3D printing has impacted model making, not in a negative way, in a very positive way, I think, in that people are realizing that having physical representations, more people are using physical representations than ever before. But I'm just curious, from all your research and deep dive into this, where do you think model making is going in terms of like to the world?
That's an excellent question. I always shy away from making predictions about things, but I think one thing that's safe to say is that, you know, you have new technologies that come in architecture and other fields, and people always think, oh, this is going to make everything else we've had before obsolete. And that is absolutely not true. The computer has not made models obsolete. 3D models have not made models obsolete. So I think there is a place in the history of architecture for models that continues to grow and continues to change. And I think one of the things that I'm seeing, because I've been a professor at an architecture school, what I see with the students is that they are very interested in model making, and they're very interested in personal handwriting, so in personal kind of styles of model making. And I think the more tools we get, be it prototyping or other things, the more options people will have. And I think that's what is going to keep it relevant, because you can cater to different interests simultaneously. And I think that's also something we just see, I think, in society generally, that things have become splintered into more different kinds of interests that coexist. And I think models are very well equipped to continue doing this. So my prediction is that there's no reason to believe that the relevance of models is going to be less than it was in the past.
Thank you.
Whew, thank God, huh?
Yeah, right.
I can't tell you how many times over the years, you know, people have told me once SketchUp came, or once, you know, all these 3D modeling softwares came, oh, you're going to be done, you know, you're not going to be building models anymore. And I'm like, yeah, we'll see. I don't know. So it's good to hear that we've got a future. So,
well, I think one of the things that is to be said for this is that skills are not something you can easily replace. A skilled craftsman or a professional is not something you can just replace by SketchUp. That's just not how this works. At least historically speaking, I can confirm to you that that's not how it works.
That's great. All right. So does anybody have any other questions before we sign off? We're a little over time, but that's, I mean, again, perfectly fine. Anybody else have anything? Well, I guess we'll close then and say thank you so much for coming to this talk. Appreciate it. Thank you, Teresa, for sharing your book with us. I would highly suggest, again, here, I'll show it again. Again, I would highly suggest reading it. It's actually, it's great to sort of understand sort of where our works have come from. You know, definitely a great read. And Sam, did you have anything to add to or no?
Yeah, I just wanted to thank Teresa, as you just did, for joining us for this meetup, and for Aaron for the tremendous amount of homework that you've done, and reading the book, and for leading this discussion. Check our website for more meetups. We'll put them up there just as soon as they're confirmed. Leading up to the conference, the virtual conference, we're going to be showing some of our workshops and tours from our 2021 virtual conference. So there's a lot of really good stuff. this session, because it's being recorded, we will make it available on our website on the tab called Meetups. It's in the resource section of the website. So we'll be able to see that in a few days. So feel free to share and tell your friends.
And if you're curious about anything about how the conference goes, it's basically like this whole banter right here, just for a couple days. So it's really great. We share some great ideas. We share, it's a lot of, and sometimes there's far out there ideas as well. We get some interesting impromptu tours as well of people's shops, but it's definitely a great experience. One of my favorites. I look forward to it every time we do it. So please sign up for the conference. We're looking to have a great time.
Yeah, absolutely. We can't make it any cheaper than what we're doing.
I know, right?
Absolutely no travel cost, just the cost of your personal refreshments that you might choose to stock up on in advance of the 2 days of basically sitting in your chair glued to the screen. It was a lot of fun last time, and I think it'll be great fun this time as well. So if you have any questions at all, feel free to drop me a line at info@modelmakers.org. You can go to the website and see a bunch of links there to contact me as well. Okay, thank you very much, everyone, for joining us, and we'll
See you guys in March.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
All right,
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Aaron. Thank you,
Bye.
Teresa. Thank you, Sam.
Thank you, Teresa.
you.
Appreciate it.